He told the court I was gone, said I didn't know my own name, that I mistook the mailman for my husband, that I talked to shadows and kept trash in the freezer. He said I was confused, unwell, no longer able to care for myself. I sat in that same house he talked about, listening. Not one footstep of his had touched my floor in months, not one visit, not one kind check-in. But he stood there, bold as daylight, telling strangers I needed supervision. Said my memory was too far gone to manage my own accounts, that I was wasting away in filth. But I remembered every word he said, every lie. I may not have had power in that courtroom, but I had eyes and ears and the truth. He said I didn't know what day it was, but I knew what he stole, and I wrote down every date. If you're still here listening to me, thank you. I don't know where you are or what you've been through, but I'm glad you found this story. Sometimes, the hardest part of surviving isn't the pain itself. It's the silence that follows. So let me ask you something, and be honest with yourself even if you don't say it out loud. Has anyone ever tried to erase you while you were still breathing? Made you feel like your presence was just a problem they had to manage? Because that's what happened to me, and I carried it alone for longer than I care to admit. But I wasn't truly alone. Not in the end. And neither are you. If any part of this sounds like your story too, I hope you leave a word below, a line, a sentence, something real. Because sometimes telling the truth, even just once, can be the start of everything changing. My name is Margaret. I'm 78, and I've lived in this house for almost 50 years. It's where I raised my boys, where I nursed my husband through his final months, where I planted roses he never got to see bloom. I was a nurse before all that, back when hospitals smelled like antiseptic and the rules were tougher. But the care was softer. I wasn't rich, but I made sure my boys never went hungry. I made sure they had clean shirts for school, hot food on cold mornings, and stories at night, even when I could barely keep my eyes open. Life didn't break me, but it slowed me down, especially after my knees gave out and I slipped near the back steps one morning. Nothing serious, just a bruise and a limp that lingered longer than expected. That's when Matthew started calling more often. He was my late husband's cousin's son, hadn't seen him in years, but out of nowhere, there he was on the phone, checking in. Sweet voice, said all the right things, asked how I was eating, if the lights were working, if the neighbors were noisy again. Said I could call him anytime, that family looks out for each other. I didn't have a reason not to believe him. I thought he meant well, but then came the papers. Big words I didn't understand at first, printed neat on heavy envelopes. A few signatures here and there. I thought it was to help me with bills or to make things easier at the pharmacy. But things didn't get easier. They got quieter. And he stopped calling not long after that. It started small, like most things that end up hurting do. One morning, I realized I hadn't gotten any mail in over a week. Which was odd, because I used to get the newspaper, water bills, letters from the clinic. Nothing special. Just the kind of things that remind you you're still on someone's list. I figured maybe the postman had skipped a day or two, maybe the rain had delayed things. But then the phone rang. It was the bank. A young woman on the other end asked if I had approved a wire transfer for close to $2,000. I told her no, I hadn't, and she went quiet. Then she said something I still remember clear as a bell. "The request came through your representative, ma'am." I didn't even know I had one. The next morning, I walked to the living room and saw that something was missing. I didn't notice it right away, but when I looked at the wall above the fireplace, it hit me. My husband's medals were gone, every single one. Framed together in glass, cleaned every spring, hanging in the same spot for 26 years, and just gone. I checked the hallway next. My oldest photo albums. The ones with letters folded between the pages. The baby shoes, the wedding card from my mother, gone. At first, I thought maybe I was misplacing things. Maybe my memory had played a trick. But that same afternoon, 2 people showed up at the door, wearing gloves and holding trash bags. Said they were there on behalf of Matthew. That they were hired to declutter. I stood there frozen as they walked past me, like I was invisible, heading for the closets, the attic, the back room. I asked them to stop. I told them those boxes weren't garbage, that some of those things were older than them, full of handwriting and names that didn't exist anymore. They smiled politely and said, We were told this is for your safety. I sat down in the kitchen, wrapped a shawl around my shoulders even though it wasn't cold, and listened to them throw away my life. One bag after another, the sound of things hitting plastic, the footsteps moving faster with each trip. I didn't have the strength to yell. All I could do was watch. And in that moment, I knew something was deeply, painfully wrong. Winter always had a way of making this house feel older than it was, but that year it was different. It didn't just feel cold in the usual way. It felt mean. The kind of cold that crawls up through the floors and into your knees, even when you're wearing 2 pairs of socks and slippers that used to feel like little furnaces. The heater wheezed one morning, rattled like it was choking on dust, then just gave up. I tapped the thermostat, checked the pilot light, unplugged and replugged what I could, but nothing came back on. So I called Matthew. I didn't panic, I just thought, maybe he'd send someone, maybe he'd do what he promised when he first said I'd never have to worry again. I left 2 voicemails that day, then one the next. By the third, I just sat by the kitchen phone staring at it, like it might come alive and apologize for staying quiet. No one came, not for days. I used to have a little portable heater in the spare room, but that had been taken during the decluttering. I found 2 soup cans in the back of the pantry, heated them on the stove, and kept them next to my feet for warmth like I used to do when I was little. I wore a coat to sleep. Sometimes I'd wrap my legs in towels because all my wool blankets had been boxed up and hauled away. The windows fogged from the inside with every breath, and I stopped opening them because the draft would make my fingers go stiff. When the neighbors started looking at me differently, when they began asking if I was feeling okay, if I needed anything, I knew why. Matthew had told them I was confused, that I didn't want help, that I pushed people away, that I was spiraling. They smiled at me kindly, the way you smile at someone you pity but don't plan to sit with. And I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I wasn't confused. I was alone, and cold, with soup cans and wet socks for company. And I realized then, if I didn't start writing things down, my word would never stand against his. So I started documenting. I took photos, not just of the things he took, but of the spaces left behind. The blank wall where the medals were. The pantry with nothing but salt and vinegar. The phone screen with unanswered calls and timestamps. I wrote dates beside every photo, scribbled down what I heard and what I didn't, what I tried and how many times I tried it. I logged it all, not because I thought anyone would listen, but because someday someone might. And when that day came, I needed to be ready. I thought I'd gotten used to being invisible. The phone didn't ring, the door never knocked, and most days passed without hearing another person's voice. But one afternoon, I saw movement through the curtains. It was Mrs. Eileen, the woman who lived 2 doors down. We hadn't spoken much beyond garden talk and weather, but she always waved when she saw me. That day, instead of a wave, she walked straight to my front step and slid a card through the gap in the door. I picked it up slowly, thinking maybe it was a flyer or something about the neighborhood watch, but it wasn't. It was handwritten, in small, careful script that shook just a little. It said, "If you ever need help, just blink twice next time I wave." I read it 3 times before I believed it. And the next day, when she walked by and gave her usual little wave, I stood in the front window and blinked. Once, then twice. She paused for just a second, then nodded like she already knew. 3 days later, she didn't wave. She just stood near the gate and looked up at the house, then walked away with her phone to her ear. I thought maybe she'd called the police, or a charity, or maybe even a church group. But it wasn't the police. It wasn't anyone loud or forceful. A week after I blinked, a woman knocked gently on the door. She had no uniform, but her coat had a patch, and she wore a lanyard with a state seal on it. She said she was with an elder care agency, that someone had filed a concern. I stepped back and let her in. No explanations, no apologies. Just the creak of the door and her footsteps on the dusty floor. The smell hit her first. I knew it would. When the heater went out, damp crept into everything. The curtains held it, the floors soaked it up. It smelled like mildew and loneliness. Then she saw the kitchen wall. I'd made a space beside the stove where I taped every receipt, every photo I printed from my little phone, every handwritten log with a date and time and call. She didn't say a word at first, just looked. And then, very softly, she asked, "Can I sit down?" I nodded, and we both sat at the kitchen table with its chipped edge and cold surface. She read through my notes, held the photos close to the light. Her hands didn't shake. Mine did. She asked how long it had been like this. I told her the truth. She asked if Matthew had come by in the past 6 months. I told her he hadn't set foot inside since the cleaners. She looked at me for a long time. Not with pity, but with something else. Like maybe she'd seen this before and hated seeing it again. And then she said quietly that she believed me. That was the last thing he expected. Not pity. Not confusion. Not weakness. But someone walking through the door and believing me. 3 days later, the woman returned. But she didn't come alone. This time, there were 2 others with her. Both quiet, both carrying clipboards and cameras. Not the kind you see on TV, but the plain ones that get close to the truth, without needing much light. They asked to walk through the house, and I didn't stop them. I just stepped aside and let them see it all for themselves. The peeling corners of wallpaper, where the moisture had lifted the glue. The stains in the corners of the ceiling, where the roof had let in a whisper of rain and never dried right. The mold that bloomed behind the radiator like something wild, untamed. They noted the broken thermostat, the cold air seeping through the windows, the dust on everything that wasn't used daily. They checked the fridge, half empty, a few spoiled things in the back. The power was still on, but the gas had been shut off the week before. The bills were still in my name, but I hadn't seen one delivered in months. They opened drawers, not out of disrespect, but care. Under the sink, they found a bundle of envelopes, rubber banded together, unopened. Some from insurance, some from the court. Legal papers that had been forwarded, then hidden, probably by the same hands that called themselves guardian. I brought out my journal. It wasn't much, a little black book with pages that curled at the edges from being opened too many times. Every entry had a date, a time, a description. When I called, who didn't answer? What was taken? What broke and stayed broken? I handed it to the one with the kind eyes. She held it like it was something sacred. I told her I didn't have a computer or anything digital to scan things in, but I'd done what I could. I said I had nothing fancy, just a pen, a phone with 10% battery, and the will to be heard. She nodded and said that was more than most had. They asked if Matthew had been by, if he'd visited, sent anyone, checked on anything at all. I looked them in the eye and said, not once, not a card, not a knock, not a voice down the hallway calling my name, just silence. And the silence told its own story. The woman with the clipboard closed her notes, looked around one more time, and told me they'd be in touch very soon. She didn't promise anything, but I saw something in her face I hadn't seen in a while. Purpose. Not sympathy. Purpose. And that gave me just enough breath to wait. It didn't take long after their visit. The agency must have moved faster than I expected, because within the week, I heard through Mrs. Eileen that someone had been trying to reach Matthew. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. And when he finally answered, they told him he needed to come in. No more hiding behind paperwork. No more long-distance silence. He had to sit face to face with people who weren't buying his rehearsed concern. When he walked into their office, he wore that same pressed shirt he always wore to weddings and funerals. The one that looked like care on the outside but smelled like dust when you got too close. They said he acted surprised. Offended even. As if the whole thing was some mix-up. Told them I had a long history of being difficult, that I had refused help at every turn, that he'd done everything he could, but I was too far gone to recognize it. Said I was delusional, that I'd always been a hoarder. That the mess wasn't new, it was just getting worse. He used words like deterioration and decline, painting pictures with words he knew they'd heard before in real cases. But what he didn't know, what he never saw coming, was that they didn't come empty-handed. The woman with the kind eyes opened a folder in front of him. She laid out copies of my journal, handwritten and dated, neat as I could manage with the same blue pen I'd had for months. Then came the photographs, time-stamped, room by room, day after day. Proof of what was taken, what was broken, what was never repaired. Then the bank records. Withdrawals made in my name from a branch in a city I hadn't set foot in for years. Money moved, accounts renamed. The room went quiet, I imagine, the way rooms do when truth enters without knocking. He tried to talk his way around it, said maybe I'd faked the records, maybe I misunderstood, maybe I wrote things down in confusion. But for every lie he tried to sell, I had proof of its opposite. When they showed him the gas bill, cut off in the middle of January, and the photo of me in 2 coats curled up on a couch next to a pot of water I'd been using to keep my hands warm, his face changed. Not out of shame, but fear. Because he realized that everything he'd counted on, my silence, my supposed forgetfulness, my invisibility, had turned on him. I wasn't lost, I was watching, and I wasn't confused. I was documenting. That meeting didn't end in shouting, it ended in facts, cold ones. And for the first time, the story he'd told for a year finally had a new narrator. Me. The morning of the hearing, I woke up before the sun did. I sat at the edge of my bed for a while, letting the quiet settle, then pulled out the same pair of shoes I wore to my husband's memorial. They were a little stiff, but still shined with polish. I pressed my skirt the best I could with an old iron that still worked, if you leaned on it just right. I combed my hair slowly, pinning it back with the clips my daughter once gave me, and I took a moment before leaving the house to stand in the doorway and breathe. This time, I wasn't waiting for someone to come save me. I was walking in for myself. The courtroom smelled like clean floors and fresh paper. You could tell it had seen too much, and still tried to stay neat. When I stepped in, heads turned. Not because I made noise or wore something flashy, but because I was supposed to be a ghost, someone fragile and fading. They expected someone sunken and silent. But I brought my spine. I walked past Matthew without looking his way. I didn't need to. He felt it. The judge was an older woman with eyes that didn't blink much. She introduced the case, then asked to begin with submitted documentation. And there, for the first time, I heard my own handwriting read aloud by someone who mattered. She read entries from my journal, the dates I wrote down, the missed calls, the photos, the report from the investigator. She asked if I could confirm them, and I said yes, every single word. Then she turned to Matthew, asked him to explain the withdrawals, the missing items, the utilities that went unpaid. He tried, he stuttered, he said I wasn't lucid, that I misunderstood things, that I'd always had a tendency to make things up. But every time he spoke, the room grew heavier with the weight of what had already been seen. Because what I brought wasn't just emotion, it was detail, it was order, it was truth. When she held up a copy of my bank statement and asked him if he had permission to move those funds, he said something about oversight. She asked again, and this time he didn't answer, he just looked down. I didn't smile, I didn't speak, I didn't need to. He said I wasn't lucid, but I remembered every dollar he took, every name he forged, every silence he left behind. And now every one of those lies sat in front of him, documented in black and white, read aloud in a room where silence no longer protected him. When they asked if I had anything I wanted to say, the whole room turned toward me. The silence didn't feel heavy anymore, it felt like permission. I stood up slowly, steadying myself with one hand on the table, not because I was weak, but because I wanted to rise with care. Every eye in that room had looked at me before they knew my name, and I wanted them to see me now. Clearly, fully, with nothing hidden behind paperwork or assumption. I looked at him, at Matthew. And I didn't blink. I didn't lower my gaze or soften my tone. I looked him in the eye and said, "You didn't just steal money. You tried to erase me. You took my voice, my warmth, the life I built in pieces across years. You told the world I was fading, so you could step in and rearrange the pieces as if I never existed. But I was still here. And I remembered everything. I told the court that this wasn't just about bank accounts or heat or missing metals. It was about something deeper. It was about the way the world lets quiet people disappear. I said, for every elder locked in silence, may my voice echo where theirs couldn't. I spoke for the ones who never got their chance to be heard. For the ones who died with their truths packed away in storage units or brushed aside in courtrooms that didn't believe them. I said, I wasn't a mistake in his story. I was the part he tried to skip, but I kept turning the page. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I just spoke. And when I finished, the judge sat still for a moment before responding. Her voice was low, but firm. She said, "You are lucid, and you are brave. And this court owes you more than a verdict. It owes you an apology." I didn't need applause, I didn't need comfort, I just needed to be seen. And that day, finally, I was. A few weeks after the hearing, a letter arrived in a clean white envelope, not folded, not crumpled, not tucked behind a utility bill like so many others had been. It came with a signature, a seal, and words I read twice to be sure they were real. The power of attorney was revoked, completely and without delay. My name, my choices, my voice, they were mine again. I folded the paper slowly, not out of fear, but to savor the moment. Not long after that, another envelope came. This one from the bank. The funds Matthew had moved were being returned. Every last dollar he siphoned, while telling the world I couldn't count past 10. They said there might be a few delays, a few formalities, but the apology they added at the end told me everything I needed to know. People had finally stopped treating me like a case file and started treating me like a person. They assigned a new social worker. Her name was Lena. She didn't talk down to me. She didn't tiptoe around questions. She came in with a notepad, a kind smile, and the kind of presence that felt like someone finally knocked and waited for you to answer. She asked what I needed. I told her the truth. I said I needed heat. I needed my front window fixed. I needed the mold removed. And I needed someone to believe me when I said I wasn't done living. She didn't nod out of politeness. She wrote everything down. Within 2 weeks, a small team came to clean the house. Not to erase my past, but to repair what neglect had allowed to rot. They asked before moving anything. They listened when I said which items needed to stay where they were. They even offered to help reframe the photo of my husband that had fallen behind the bookshelf. One morning, I walked into my kitchen and didn't feel dread. The walls had been repainted in the same soft shade they were when I moved in all those years ago. The floor didn't creak under my steps, and the sunlight, for the first time in what felt like forever, came through the window and landed on something other than dust. I stood there for a long time, just holding my tea, breathing in a space that didn't smell like damp or despair. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was reclaiming. Every drawer, every corner, every quiet part of this house that had held my sorrow was slowly becoming mine again. And this time, no one would take it without a fight. If someone ever tried to erase you with a lie, I want you to know, I see you. If they stood in rooms you weren't invited into and told stories that made you seem small, confused, or incapable, just so they could take what you built, I know that pain. I've lived it. And if they told the world you were losing it while quietly pulling your life apart behind your back, then right below, I remembered. That's all you need to say. I remembered. You don't owe them an explanation. You don't owe them your silence. And if you're watching this alone right now, I hope you'll subscribe and stay a while. Because here, your truth matters.